California True Crime is a podcast that sometimes deals with heinous acts of violence towards other individuals. This podcast may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to part 2 of this episode of California True Crime, The Man in the Trunk. Are you ready to finish the story, Charles?
Yes, I'm excited about it.
If you haven't listened to part 1 of this, we suggest that you do. Otherwise, we think you'll be really, really lost. So when we left off on part 1, Emma Ledoux had finally been arrested in Antioch, California. And we're going to pick up right there. We're going to tell you a little bit about who Emma Ledoux is. She was born on September 10th, 1875, and grew up on a ranch in Jackson, California. As a child, she was known for running around outside and her love of animals. She had 8 siblings and was described as tender-hearted, shy, and sensitive. As a child, she was also afraid of the sight of blood. Now, I don't know if she had a vasovagal response where you pass out if you see it or you just talk about it, but it was something she was sensitive to. And as she grew up into a woman, she was described in the papers as thoroughly feminine, which bugged me as a description. I don't know.
Yeah, it was an odd description because it wasn't followed up with anything else. It was just she was thoroughly feminine. So it goes back to, again, what you've talked a lot about so far is that coded language and the way the newspaper reporters are specifically using keywords and phrases to describe, again, not just her, but a few other of the key players in the story.
Right, and I think we have to remember people use different kinds of language at the time as well. But it's just a really odd way to describe, especially because they're referring to a child. And like I said, we'll talk about this later, but it comes up how they describe her as a child versus an adult. She's been married several times. The first of her marriages was to a Charles Barrett when she was just 16 years old. She had to actually get special permission from her mother to marry him. They are only married for about 4 years before they divorce. After they divorce, she marries a man we've heard a bit about already, named William Williams. The two move to Arizona, where they stay married for 6 years until he passes away. It was recorded he passed away from heart failure. She does get an insurance payout after he dies, and while $10,000 is a figure I saw a lot, and I know I mentioned it before, there are other articles which say she didn't get nearly this much, so it's a little unclear how much money she did get. William, McVicar, and Emma all knew each other in Arizona, and after Williams passes away, she marries McVicar on September 1st, 1902. The two stayed married for 2 years before they separate. Whether or not the two are actually married or divorced and not just separated will become central to this case. Emma will claim that the two are divorced and that there is actual evidence that she had filed paperwork for divorce. However, whether or not she finished it is something that's never proven. And I should note that California records at this time aren't kept very well. They're kept better than they had been being kept. In 1858, California state started keeping records like birth, death, and divorce. So I'm not really sure if it's possible that she genuinely thought that they were divorced, or if she's just lying, or what's going on here. I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know. It's possible because Jamestown, it is up in the hills, and in the early 1900s, it's possible that she did all the paperwork and maybe mailed it in or filed it, because I'm not 100% sure where it would be kept in 1902.
Yeah, I believe it would be kept at the county. And this is something she'll maintain throughout this, is that they were divorced, or that she believed they were divorced. So I'm not really sure what the truth there is.
Well, it's an interesting argument, because then where are you divorced when your paperwork gets filed, or are you divorced when both parties sign the paperwork to begin with?
Yeah, I think a judge has to okay it, but I don't know if divorce. Tried to look a lot of this up because I don't know what divorce looked like back then. And I think it's not dissimilar to now, but you had to have cause, you had to have a reason.
Okay.
And I just don't know if she could have filed the paperwork and a judge could have approved it, and you don't really need the person to know, or you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
And the reason her not actually being divorced from McVicar is a problem is because on August 26, 1905, she married Eugene Ledoux. Ledoux is from Jackson and someone she has known since she was a child. And there are many reports she's been in love with him since they were very young. Sort of the one that got away, except in this case, they do eventually get married. That's what the papers kind of painted as. And I want to give you a physical description of Emma to have in your mind as I tell the story. We will put a picture up on our website. She really is as people have been describing her. She's only about 5 feet 2 inches and somewhere between 100 and 110 pounds. Most of the pictures I've seen, she's dressed stylishly in the attire of the period, and her dark hair swept up into a bun-like hairstyle. After she's arrested, she's taken in front of a judge in Antioch with the goal of getting her back to Stockton. Police have heard from many witnesses and, of course, are very interested in hearing what she has to say about what happened to McVicar. The police escort her on a train back to Stockton. In the meantime, police in Stockton are still making inquiries on the case, and this is just the Monday, so just a couple of days after they found the trunk.
The body's found on Saturday, correct?
Yeah, right.
So this is 72 hours later, they've already arrested someone, which again is amazing that in 1906, within 72 hours, they've found a body, tracked the killer, alleged murderer, and then all the way in San Francisco, and then are bringing her back.
Yeah, they really put a lot of manpower into it. But it's still important to remember that there are a lot of people around the state doing things still for the case. Not all is focused on Emma and finding her. And in the meantime, police in Stockton are still making inquiries into the case. The cause of death is still blunt force trauma to the head, and the coroner didn't find any traces of poisons in his system. But while Stockton is a large city, it doesn't have the same type of access to experts and more finely honed tests. So the coroner sends McVicar's stomach to an expert chemist in San Francisco.
It's interesting that they would do that, to ship somebody's stomach, like remove the stomach from the rest of the body and then ship it all the way to San Francisco.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what that would entail. It wasn't a really good description of how they did that. And it is interesting to know, I think I had a lot of questions at this time about forensic practices in 1906 and the soundness of the science they're using. Because a lot of this stuff would take, even now, I think weeks to kind of do and do correctly.
All right.
So it's sort of an interesting point, I think.
Well, and also the contamination of the evidence. What other things could be introduced into the stomach just from handling it by, the police, and how are they wrapping it? And this is already 3 days after he's died. So what's was it 15-hour trip to San Francisco, or was it 15 hours?
No, I think that was to Jackson. I don't think it's
Jackson,
15 hours, but it's still probably a good chunk of time.
Right. And then how long would they test it for? And
yeah.
And is it being done by forensic experts, or?
The person in San Francisco is an expert in a chemist.
Okay.
So yeah, I believe that's why they send it there. But as to the specific procedure, that wasn't laid out for me. Words quickly spreads once Emma is arrested, and just as quickly, people learn the police are bringing her to Stockton. A kind of excitement spreads through the city, and there's just so much publicity. Reporters from around the country descend into Stockton, not dissimilarly to what we see now. They're talking to people on the street, they're trying to find out more about her, and people in Stockton are just super excited by this. They're interested, they want to know more. And fueling this excitement is that people are still able to look at McVicar's body, which really bothers me, especially now that they've identified him. Over 1,000 people stand in line to get a glimpse of his body. It's right out next to people. It's covered by a sheet, but there are reports of people lifting that up to look. The majority of the people who come to view the body are apparently women and children. And this gets the press even more interested. The idea that a woman may have committed this murder, and now that woman would want to look at the body. And I don't know if you think that's odd. And I don't know what majority means, if it's, 51% or 90%, but they're really interested in it.
It's 1906, so the majority of the men would be, I would imagine, be at work. And this is not a time where there's a huge female presence in the workplace. And there's no TV. And it's the biggest thing to happen in Stockton in a while. I can definitely see why people would be interested in it. I mean, I think we get kind of spoiled with the idea of a 24-hour news cycle now, and kind of think if it's a new invention, but it seems like from your description of what's going on, it's not. I mean, there's newspapers and people are, I guess, excited is a terrible word to use, but it's a form of entertainment.
Well, and Stockton is a city people can get in and out of pretty easily if
Right.
you're in California, especially. And this has been covered not just by California papers, but by papers across the country.
And in a train hub and a shipping center, like I can see people getting off a train, and you got a 2-hour layover. Hey, let's go, let's look at the McVicar body. But what's crazy though is that this is all while the medical examiner is examining him. So he's being autopsied and then put back out on display.
Based on the quickness that they described all this happens, I think that's the only thing that makes sense. So people know she's being brought to Stockton on the train, and they've been reading and talking about this nonstop, and none of them want to miss their chance to catch a glimpse of her. And the papers talk about her and the murder from the get-go as if it's a foregone conclusion that she did this. There's never really any question. And we're only a couple of days out. They don't know which train she's coming on, so they rush to 2 different stations in Stockton. They mob both the Southern Pacific Depot and the Santa Fe Depot. So many people show up in both locations that they're packed in the buildings really tight, and they're spilling out onto the street. When the train pulls into the Southern Pacific Depot, people start rushing the exits of the train, trying to get to her. Emma and the police are in the baggage car, and when she emerges from the train, people start yelling and shoving just to get a glimpse of her. The police actually have to create a path through the crowd. And adding to the gossip, when Emma comes off the train, she doesn't appear how people sort of expect her to appear in the situation. She's been arrested. They're saying she's murdered someone. But when she comes off the train, she's smiling. She looks happy. And I don't know what a normal reaction to having all of these people waiting for you, mobbing you, trying to see you, yelling her name would really be. I don't know. What do you think?
I think, and I know we've said this before, but as people who really enjoy true crime, watch a lot of those Datelines in 48 Hours and those shows. And one thing I always go back to is some of those investigators say when we're interviewing somebody, they didn't react like a victim should react. And I think a lot of times we see that. We see people reacting to a stressful situation in a certain way, and we say that if I was in their shoes, I wouldn't do that. When in fact, we don't know how we would react until we're there.
Right.
And having already put the blame on her without any evidence being found, there's not a trial. She's arrested for this crime, but it's not proven that she did it yet. I mean, she is up to now. She's the most likely suspect, but that's all she is right now. Is just a suspect. But I think they're already laying that groundwork for she's guilty. If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it's guilty.
And a lot will be put into how she acts, both in her ability to kind of, in San Francisco, she acted just normal, and also here she seems happy. And I just don't know how I would act in this situation. On the way to jail, she appears to be joking with officers, and when she gets to Stockton, it's called the Stockton Jail, she's doing the same with the officers and guards there. So this doesn't help the gossip. Although I will say many of the papers describe her as acting normal or in good spirits right before they describe her breaking down and crying. So I'm not really sure what her actual behavior is like. Those two things don't really go together. A lot of this may be what they choose to describe, but you have to think that this is the kind of characterization in a case so widely read, it's affecting the impartiality of a possible jury pool. That's all I could think when I was reading it.
And those descriptions are from newspapers of the time. So for more lurid storytelling, I mean, it makes a better story that this demonized woman gets off and she's laughing and I mean they've already spent 2 days portraying her as a predator on the prowl and looking for victims, and so then to see her jovial and joking, and I can see that playing better into like the narrative for those newspaper articles.
Right. And this is one of those cases where there's just a ton of information about her and also not very much. So I don't know if they're just reporting the stuff that, well, like you said, will sell papers. So if she's jovial or, people want to read her being a terrible person, they're reporting that and leaving out other things. It's just hard to tell. She's held on the 2nd floor of the Stockton jail where the Stockton jailer and his family live. It seems his wife is responsible for taking care of Emma and whatever women come into the jail. She feeds her, for instance. The 2nd floor of the jail has wide open windows all around it, so people are in the buildings surrounding the jail, watching everything that's happening in the station. If Emma eats, they can watch it. It's written about. So this is really court TV before court TV.
Yeah, it's even before the court TV. It's a reality show of a prisoner in a jail. I also found it interesting that the jailer and his family live at the jail.
Yeah. From what I can tell in newspapers, Emma only tells her side of the story once, and then it's reported that she refuses to talk about what happened to McVicar. She's emphatic that she did not murder McVicar, but she says that she was present when it happened. According to her, on Friday, the 23rd, the night before the trunk was found, her, McVicar, and a man named Joe Miller spent all night drinking in Stockton. Her and McVicar seemed to enjoy a high lifestyle together, so drinking was pretty common. It's also mentioned that the two liked nice things. So they had nice clothes, shoes, which is something that goes back to him being found, being in a really nice suit. And I only mention this because it reminded me a little bit about Dorothea Puente.
Yeah. Somebody who really likes a certain kind of lifestyle and alcohol and kind of carousing around and then leading to something terrible.
Well, yeah, it definitely leads to something terrible. And apparently on this night, they had a lot to drink and were all pretty drunk. She claimed that she had trouble remembering all of it, and it didn't seem quite real. They spent the evening going in and out of the room, finally ending their night at 4 a.m. Back in the hotel room, she left McVicar and Miller alone for about 10 minutes, and when she walked back in, Joe Miller was standing over McVicar's body, which was now on the floor, and he was frothing at the mouth. She helped Miller lift McVicar's body onto the bed, and then turned to go for help. Miller stopped her when he pulled out a gun and a knife. It was then she noticed a bottle of carbolic acid that she had purchased on the ground and empty. Their things also looked out of sorts, as if someone had rifled through them. Miller threatened to kill Emma if she didn't keep quiet. Carbolic acid is commonly called phenol, and it was used for sterilization purposes, things like medical equipment or even wounds. It was a common substance in the 1900s and was extremely poisonous, and it was not uncommon for people to use it as a method of suicide. At the time, carbolic acid was not regulated, so people could easily get their hands on it, and even some people used it for health purposes. It's digestible and can come through the skin as well, so you can put it in your mouth or it will soak into your skin.
Right, and people like John Kellogg would use it for quote-unquote health purposes, specifically to keep women from masturbating. He would drop some on their genitals. It was really interesting history all of its own. Some of the symptoms of carbolic acid poisoning are trouble breathing, rapid heartbeat, severe stomach pains, burning in the mouth, and seizures.
Emma told police she believed Miller had poisoned McVicar with the carbolic acid, but she did not see him do so as she was out of the room. Miller then came up with a plan to purchase a trunk and a rope and sent Emma to do so, and she did do so. She also helped Miller put McVicar in the trunk and had it sent to the train station. Her personal intention was to try to get to her mother in Jackson, but when the trunk was late for the train, the two of them began to sort of freak out, and when they overheard a baggage man comment on how heavy the trunk was, they lost it. Miller forced her to take the train to San Francisco and even had them sit in separate compartments. About halfway through the journey, Miller came and sat with her. He gave her instructions to go to the Royal House in San Francisco. On that Monday, the day she left San Francisco, she said Miller met her and the two started to go to Jackson. However, when they reached the Richmond stop, Miller got off the train and instructed her to head to Antioch where he would meet her. This was the last time she saw him. As for motive, Emma claimed that Joe Miller thought McVicar had money and intended to rob him. There were apparently rumors that McVicar had most of the money from the insurance payout from William Williams, and several witnesses will come forward to say that he had used the money himself. So McVicar had actually used the money that she got from William Williams' death on speculating in Arizona and California. However, despite his nice threads and his going out, he didn't seem to have very much money on him. And how much money McVicar had on him before he died will be something that comes up again and again. And the police and the district attorney can't seem to prove that he had very much on him at the time, which becomes a problem for establishing any kind of motive when they finally charge someone with murder. Either way, Emma claims Joe Miller thought McVicar had money and killed him in order to rob him. Right away, the police don't believe this story from Emma. And the district attorney in particular believes that this Joe Miller person is not real. The DA, in fact, tells the press many times that Miller is a myth. And quite fairly, looking at the story, as well as everything else witnesses have said, it does appear that Emma is lying about parts of the story. For instance, this seems to be a very different story than the one she told Joseph Healy. And as police have tracked down McVicar's brothers, they know one was not with her at the time of Mac's death, which she had told Healy one was. So that's a big lie that she tells Healy. And it's hard to ignore the fact that there are lies. And to the police, the lies, plus the fact that she's absolutely connected to the trunk, is proof she murdered McVicar. What they don't seem to know is exactly how or exactly why. I mean, they know he's in the trunk, and that to them is a blaring red light. What do you think?
It's hard because I think you're right. There's a lot of inconsistencies, and there's a lot of. It's hard to say if they're lies or falsehoods or what, but the brother said he wasn't there. There wasn't a brother with him, but she does claim early on that there was somebody else there,
Right.
and there are other people saying that they saw them with somebody else.
Yeah, absolutely. She talks a lot about there being someone else. That's something she claims. She only told Healy that there was a brother that was there. So I don't know if maybe she doesn't tell that to police. So I don't know if maybe she's just trying to. She's in San Francisco. She knows this is happening. She has to come up with some story for Healy.
Right.
Maybe she's just lying to him to just kind of make things go smoothly. I don't know.
Well, yeah. I mean, if we, well, I could see it's confusing, and I think that's the hard part is that it could be she could be totally lying about everything.
Right.
She could have killed him, figured a way to get him in the trunk, and then is just playing on people's sympathies of I'm a poor defenseless woman. I could never have done this. There was somebody else doing it. Or it could all be true, and this Joe Miller person could have hung out with two people that he thought was rich and drank and had a good time, and then tried to rob him, and one thing led to another.
And as you pointed out, there were people who came forward before they had even arrested her and said they saw someone with her, another man. So I'm just not really sure what's true or false here. Emma is very adamant on a couple of points. Interestingly, that Joseph Healy is not Joe Miller. And someone who is described as almost eerily calm will become very angry when they suggest that he is. She just refuses to let them connect those two. And second, that McVicar died of poisoning. They even show her a picture of McVicar in the trunk, and her reaction is mainly stunned that there was blood in the trunk with him. Police also note that she doesn't seem upset looking at the picture of McVicar, which they believe speaks to her character. Ultimately, despite some intense questioning, she maintains her innocence the entire time. Emma's side of the story doesn't change things for police too much. Most of them are convinced she did this on her own, but they do look for Joe Miller on the off chance he might exist. They also begin to really think that McVicar may have died in a different way than originally thought, not blunt force trauma. And they're still waiting to hear from the chemist in San Francisco, but poisoning seems more and more likely.
Going back to the blunt force trauma, other than the blood, originally I believe you said there's no evidence of that. There's no bruising. There was no, like, his skull wasn't caved in, other than his nose being gashed and the prodigious amount of blood.
Right. Yeah, there's nothing on his skull. And the blood coming from his nose isn't something they think killed him.
Okay.
So poisoning to them seems more and more likely. And this theory will get a large boost when they get in touch with a close friend of Emma Ledoux, a doctor in San Francisco. Dr. John F. Dillon is a highly regarded physician and surgeon in San Francisco, and it turns out he has a story to tell police about Emma Ledoux. On Monday, March 12, 1906, 2 weeks prior to the trunk being found, Dr. Dillon received a frantic call from Emma in San Francisco asking him to come to room 21 at the Lexington House on Eddy Street. When he arrived at the hotel room between 6 and 7 p.m., he found Emma a bit frantic. She told him, quote, "Mac is in the room and he's very sick. I want you to see what you can do for him. I think he has been poisoned." When Dr. Dillon enters the room, he sees McVicar in bed writhing around in pain and looking as if he's in terrible agony. Dr. Dillon's first thought was that he had taken something to commit suicide, so he looked for signs of morphine or arsenic poisoning. Morphine is a well-known drug even now, and in 1906 readily available to most people. It was even a common ingredient in all kinds of products, sort of basically over the counter. People used it for things like menstrual cramps, for pain from teething. And I had never heard of this before, but there was a syrup I saw called Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, in which morphine and alcohol were the main ingredients, but parents gave it to help with their fussy kids. And I think that syrup was from the 1840s, but morphine is highly addictive, and lots of people were just using it for various things. Arsenic was the one I was surprised by. I've heard about arsenic more as a weapon of murder. Apparently, people did take it as a drug. It could be used, it could cause hallucinations, and some people would take it though it's extraordinarily dangerous, to enhance the sexual experience I read about. It's much more famous drug, and like most drugs, including morphine, has a really long history. It was also in a lot of common things people used, from makeup to fabric dyes and wallpaper. I really didn't know anything about arsenic's history.
Yeah, it's a very old poison, and it goes back even to before the Romans. Famous Roman Emperor Nero used it to poison some of his family members. It's also, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that it's used around this time, even in consuming absinthe, that it's used as a catalyst for, or I don't know, catalyst is the right word, but it's used in the way certain people would drink their absinthe.
Oh, okay. I was also surprised that when he walks in, he just immediately goes to thinking, oh, this is probably a suicide. But I mean, I don't know.
Well, I wonder how much. I mean, if people are consuming morphine over the counter, and arsenic is something that a doctor might go, "Oh, that person." I wonder how many accidental poisonings are happening at the time, and if it is that common for something like this to be going on.
Yeah, I don't know. Unable to tell what was affecting McVicar so terribly, he asked Emma what he might have taken. She said they had eaten beer and clams for dinner and thought he had gotten food poisoning. Dr. Dillon gave McVicar an emetic, something that would induce vomiting and flush everything out of his stomach. This caused McVicar to improve, so the doctor gave him a sleeping potion to help him rest comfortably. Before he fell asleep, the doctor asked him what he had taken, to which McVicar replied that Emma had said it might be the beer and the clams. Dr. Dillon noted that even though Emma had eaten the same thing, she did not appear sick herself. But he had no reason to suspect anything else, so he diagnosed McVicar with food poisoning, and he left the room about 7:20 p.m. that night. The next day, which would be Tuesday, March 14th, 1906, Dr. Dillon checked on McVicar and saw that he was much better, but still very weak, so he gave him a tonic to help him feel better. Emma took this time to ask Dr. Dillon if she could get some morphine for herself, as she had been unable to sleep, and admitted that she was in the habit of taking the drug. And this is a side note here, but police will find out that Emma and McVicar were both accustomed to taking morphine, and they were both basically morphine addicts. The paper will use the term morphine fiends, which is pretty judgmental, in my opinion, but...
Well, this time, too, there's a huge opium epidemic in the United States, in places like San Francisco, LA, San Diego, in California. There's a huge backlash against opium dens in certain, like in Chinatown in San Francisco, that will be talked about in an upcoming episode. But so I wonder if that kind of, again, that coded language about calling them morphine feeds is building on that fuel of public fervor over this, like the opium epidemic in the United States now.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, just for a time when a lot of people could get morphine.
Right.
This seems like a consequence of that. So
right.
It's not too surprising, I would think.
And the temperance movement and things like that.
Exactly. Dr. Dillon gave Emma a small vial of morphine and explained to her how to use it safely, and also gave her a little lecture about its dangers, just kind of warning her. From what I can tell, he gave her 1 dram, or about 60 grains of morphine. And we both spent time trying to figure out what this meant, as neither of us is an apothecary in 1906. We came up with what was 1 grain of morphine is approximately 60 milligrams. And apparently this is different depending on who your apothecary is, but this is just sort of a, I guess, theoretical standard. He gave her 60 grains, which works out to roughly 3.6 grams, which, sort of based on the different calculations, put this between 3 and 4 grams. Dr. Dillon gave Emma specific instructions on how to take and how to dilute it, but as far as we can tell, 3.6 grams is quite a bit of morphine. I looked up a standard dose of morphine is for people with acute pain, and in pill form, it's about 10 to 20 milligrams every 4 hours or so, with the patient not exceeding 120 milligrams per day. Based on what I read, it's a little different when administered in a hospital setting. The patient is getting the medicine differently, so I believe they're getting less, but with more intensity. Either way, 3.6 grams is quite a bit, and just how much morphine could cause someone to overdose is different for each person, but I read about 200 milligrams could be fatal. On the following day, Emma went to Dr. Dillon's office and asked if she could give her some cyanide of potassium. She told him she needed it to develop pictures.
So cyanide of potassium is an extremely toxic substance and can be used for developing pictures. It's been famously used in many suicides, including mathematician Alan Turing, and some cult suicides, including the People's Temple. It's basically an asphyxiant and interferes with the body's ability to use oxygen.
So basically your body suffocates.
Yes.
And I have to tell you, I had heard of many of these poisons, but I didn't really know very much about them. I know you're kind of the same. So both our Google search histories probably pretty nuts right now, just filled with poisons. Dr. Dillon didn't have cyanide of potassium in his pharmacy, so he wrote an order for 2 ounces of the drug for another pharmacy. He included the note that he knew Emma and trusted her. This new information it blows police away. Not only did it confirm Joseph Healy's story about Emma calling him in San Francisco but failing to show up to meet him, but it also solidified in their minds the possibility that McVicar was murdered using poison, and even perhaps the morphine or cyanide of potassium she received from Dr. Dillon. They also now believe that though McVicar was murdered on the 24th in Stockton, it was probably not the first time Emma had tried to murder him. And in fact, the district attorney now believed that's exactly what happened during the time the two were in San Francisco, that she made a first attempt. I do want to note here that Dr. Dillon did not seek out the police in this case. In fact, they contacted him and already knew everything he was telling them. They were basically just sort of confirming it. Emma had been the one to tell them this story, and I have a lot of thoughts about this new information, but I don't know, what do you think?
Again, it's another instance of, I think the first time I heard this, I thought, oh, obviously she's been poisoning him, slowly maybe, but when taken into consideration with everything else, I don't know. Because if they're both used to taking drugs and that was kind of a known thing, then I could see him ODing. And the fact that the doctor prescribed 3 to 4 grams of morphine, that's still, and I know that's putting my own bias from 2018 on it, and that was maybe something more common. You don't necessarily have those kind of pharmacies, but your doctor would prescribe, or you go to a local apothecary or their version of a pharmacy and get cyanide of potassium. I mean, it's deadly, but...
Well, I mean, people do use it to make photographs. That's a real thing.
Right, and I wonder if any thought was done to then seeing if that was a common thing for her.
Yeah, I
know
didn't see anything about it in the papers.
Photography wasn't necessarily... It's not like now where everybody's taking pictures of everything. And even at the turn of the century, you would take family photos for special occasions or things like that. But I wonder if they tried to find out if she knew how to. I mean, it's a complicated process. I would think that would be something that they would be able to,
Well, I will say when they find this information, they just use it to basically back up what they already believe happened, which is that she poisoned him or she killed him in some way.
Confirmation biased.
Yeah, now they think poisoning, and like I said, these poisons in particular, and they think that, obviously she may have poisoned him a couple weeks prior. Although I find it odd, there are some problems I have with that. I don't know why you're in the city, why you would call a doctor, A, if someone had been poisoned and you were trying to kill them. B, why she would call someone she knows and knows her. Just some of it just doesn't make sense to me. I'm not sure what's going on here, but I'm not sure the police do either.
Yeah, you don't hear too many stories of I'm going to try to kill my spouse, so the first thing I do is I call a doctor. I mean, you could make the argument that she was pretty sure he was going to die, so she called a doctor to make it so that people would ask, oh, or look at her as she tried to save somebody. She tried to save her husband, but why not just leave the room, let him die, and then,
Yeah, I think a lot of things fit here. I mean, she may have tried to kill him. It's unclear to me if that's actually definitely beyond a reasonable doubt the case.
Right, and I think this is an interesting one of that right down the egg, because every time you reveal a little bit more of the case, I'm like, oh, definitely, she killed. No, maybe she didn't, and it really is murky. It's not a clear cut case, and I think you're right. A lot of this is the police have a particular narrative that's being reinforced by the newspaper and reinforced with some things that Emma is doing along the way. But it's not, I guess it's not what we would think of, and not what I would think of as clear-cut, irrefutable evidence, like in a court of law, beyond a reasonable doubt.
That's how I've sort of felt about reading this. The police are able to find people who do back up Dr. Dillon's story. A porter at the Lexington house reported that when Emma and McVicar checked out, he finds 3 small vials in the room, one of which is marked with a skull and crossbones. He says he threw them out while cleaning. Another man at the hotel also reported that he showed the McVicars to their room on March 12th. He said they seemed in perfect health and were very affectionate. The last thing he saw before she called Dr. Dillon was Emma trying to get McVicar to lay down on the bed. He also said that Emma gave him money at 7:30 p.m. after Dr. Dillon had left to go out and get some tamales as well as a fork and a plate. And the article I read about the tamales didn't really offer any explanation. I immediately thought that the tamales were a pretty good food to eat if you're maybe drunk or having some issues or you've taken too much, I don't know, drugs or something, kind of soaks up.
Yeah, it could be. It could be like something, well, depending on the tamale, masa and maybe like something mild, a chicken or like a chili. And maybe it is. Maybe something that would not turn his stomach. I mean, we've all been sick and been hungry, but certain foods really turn your stomach. And if he has food poisoning from beer and clams.
Yeah, I don't know if he's eating after the doctor leaves, but
or maybe it's for her.
Maybe she's just hungry. Yeah.
Yeah.
I get the feeling you're supposed to kind of look at this like, oh, she tried to kill him and then she had tamales. But to me, just maybe my own perspective is just a little different.
Well, and going back to the story that if they're known partiers and they do go out, then like you said, I kind of agree with. I mean, after you have a few beers or more, then tamales would sound pretty good.
Yeah, it could be either. After talking with these witnesses, police modified their ideas about the crime, as I said, and they are now really focused on the poisoning, just kind of solely focused on the poisoning. To them, this would make a lot of sense, especially because poisoning would have incapacitated McVicar and have allowed her to do whatever she wanted. On March 30th, 1906, the report by the chemist comes in, and this is almost a full week since the trunk was discovered in Stockton. This entire time, Emma is being held at the Stockton City Jail, accused of murder, while police are continuing the investigation. Roy Rogers was the name of the chemist, and I'm just telling you his name because of his name.
It's Roy Rogers.
Yeah.
Not the actual...
No.
What we think of as Roy Rogers.
A different Roy Rogers.
Okay.
But an expert chemist who examined the stomach, and his findings changed the entire method of how the crime is carried out. In McVicar's stomach, he found combinations of whiskey and morphine, beer, iron, and wine and morphine, and powder papers for morphine and arsenic. And in powder papers, we spent a lot of time looking up. We think it's a delivery system, so the drugs come on those papers instead of like in a pill.
Right. So form. Yeah, you would have the morphine in powdered form, and then you would lick the paper, or you could eat the paper. It was like instead of taking a pill.
And I'm not sure what it means when they say things were found in combinations. I don't know if they were found in different parts of the stomach. So beer and iron and wine and morphine are all found together, and then somewhere else whiskey and morphine are found together, or if it means they were taken at separate times during the night or given to him, however, whatever happened. I'm not really sure.
No, or I wonder if it's like, I don't know enough about how the digestive system works, but if it's different levels, different concentrations in the stomach. But that's interesting though, that there's no, with the exception of the morphine, there's none of the other poisons that have been mentioned so far in his system that they could find.
Right. They actually find a large amount of morphine. They also find a small amount of something called chloral. And I believe when they say chloral, they're talking about chloral hydrate, which is a substance used for sleeping. And then you're right, there was no cyanide of potassium found in his body. With this new information, the police modify their thinking on what happened to McVicar. They no longer believe he was hit in the head, but they do think that he was given the chloral first in the form of what they call knockout drops. So someone would give you a couple of drops of those, and then you would go to sleep or get knocked out. And then in their minds, she then administered the large amounts of morphine to him.
But he was a known morphine user.
Right.
So, again, total speculation. And we don't know necessarily how much of chloral was in his system. Was it like, was there any reports that said, oh, this is obviously enough to knock out an adult male, or it's just a trace amount of maybe a remnant of something he took the night before? It
was just a small amount. Okay. And in their mind, that meant it wasn't enough, because I guess you can kill someone with chloral hydrate. It wasn't enough to have killed him, but it was enough to have knocked him out.
Okay.
So they think that once he was knocked out, he was probably put on the bed or knocked out on the bed, force-fed the morphine, and that this would have given her an ability to do whatever, push him into the trunk, just more malleable to her. Police, though, do not believe he died in room 97 at the California. As I said, completely under her control, she rolled him off the bed and into the trunk, still alive. They think he was alive when he went into the trunk for a few reasons. The first is that she could wield his body, so rigor mortis had not set in. The second, because his body was still warm, when they took it out of the trunk, that he hadn't really been dead very long. And lastly, he had to have been alive in the trunk for his nose to have bled as much as it did. They also believe his nose became gashed or mushed in, either from forcibly putting him into the trunk or when the trunk was pushed off the train and onto the platform when the baggage man discovered it didn't have a tag. Police believe he was put into the trunk alive, but at some point, due to a lack of oxygen, he died. Now that police believe they have a handle on what happened to McVicar, they have to find out two things: proof Emma committed this crime and a motive. And as you can imagine, when the press gets a hold of all of this information, people are even more interested and excited. And the press isn't just covering the crime, but every aspect they can find out about Emma. And it really reminded me of now. Once people hear about this crime, they start talking about every interaction they ever had. They make podcasts. And for instance, a man talks to police who sold a cleaver. He sold it to her on the 13th when she was in San Francisco 2 weeks prior. But honestly, I'm not sure what it has to do with anything. She never cuts anyone up. But he tells his entire story. They cover it as if it's a big deal. There's big splashy headlines. And like I said earlier, the newspapers closer had more information or better information. So I saw papers across the country having different information. Some papers reported that McVicar was found chopped up in the trunk, and I didn't know where that came from. So I think maybe some of that's coming from these random stories people are telling.
Well, picking up stories in one newspaper and then reprinting them, or newspaper reporters not necessarily being on the scene, but getting second and third party information. And then it sounds, wife poisons husband or wife chops up husband. One of those headlines would, I think, sell more newspapers.
Yeah, definitely. So people just come out of the woodwork to tell their stories, but people affiliated with the case or Emma start coming to town. Her mother and lawyers come to town. Joseph Healy comes to town to interview with the DA, but also walks around town talking with people. McVicar's brother and a family friend who's actually a judge comes to town, and they get to even talk to Emma. So being able to see these people, you've read about them, and now you can actually walk up and talk to them, is just, people are just kind of crazed over this.
It really does bring into due process into question. I mean, so far, none of these reports have said anything about her lawyer or, keeping, I guess, the sanctity of the case, or, now I think we're so used to elements of the case not coming out until the state is ready to prosecute or reveal it after the case or after somebody's been convicted. The fact that you could watch, somebody who's arrested for a crime, not yet convicted, but then even having the victim's family come and talk to them.
Yeah, there was a lot about Joseph Healy talking to people. I don't know who talked to them, but being able just to see these people get off the train,
Right.
It's like a cast of characters,
Yeah.
really. And you're right about impartiality, I think. It's something I thought a lot about while reading this. I don't know if Emma committed this crime. I don't know if she's innocent or if she's guilty. I do know she put him in the trunk. She's clearly lied about several things. But I don't know if that proves if she's a murderer. It's just hard for me to say. And I actually think an accidental death or suicide fits the information just as well, based on what we know. However, as she is in custody, the district attorney is going to move forward to a trial. And people who judge Emma are people who are in the area. And the whole thing has been so highly publicized, it's hard to imagine there's anyone who hasn't been affected by this reporting. And the reporting is a matter of fact, again, that she committed this crime. It's also a matter of fact about the kind of woman she is. And as I said, there's a lot of information. I mean, I could tell you what she ate and drank in San Francisco, but I have a hard time telling you what kind of person she is. And that's true of a lot of the people they'll write about. And to fully understand that, I'm going to have to share some of the words they used to describe her in the paper, just so you can get a sense of how they're kind of casting her, what light they're putting her in. They really describe her quite differently as an adult as they do a child. We talked about this a few times already. Some of the examples of how she's talked about as a child, she's described as coquettish, which means flirty, which I find to be a gross way to describe a child. She's tender-hearted, again, thoroughly feminine. And these are presented as good things as they pertain to being a woman. On the flip side, as an adult, the press uses words that when you first hear them, they're just kind of normal words, but used in the context of describing a woman are more judgmental. Not because there's anything wrong with some of the descriptions, but because this is not how women are naturally supposed to act. Some common words they use are calm, callous. They talk a lot about how she liked to go on a time, which I took to mean she liked to party, hang out with men. They talk about her intelligence, how smart she is, but when they talk about it, they really use it in a predatory way. More overt words, and these are just a few examples that are, because there's a lot more, are enchantress, psychological phenomenon, mentally deranged, tigress, fiendish, female monstrosity, and the champion murderess of California. And again, I can't stress enough, this is all within 24 to 48 hours. She's not even caught yet, and they're often using these words.
Right. It's like the newspapers are spinning this narrative of this villainess who's on the prowl for men, who's stalking the streets of Stockton and San Francisco looking for her next victim.
Yeah, and she may be. It's just impossible for me to believe they knew this, A, at first without even knowing her name, and B, within the first 24 to 48 hours. And they don't ever really change much about what they know. They don't add more to her character. And a lot of it seems to be less about, did a woman commit this crime? So the emphasis really being on the credibleness of it being a woman possibly committing this crime.
Right. I think also at this time, it's the major form of entertainment. And I think that in some cases, those newspapers have to be seen as not necessarily the most credible source of news, but rather how people are being entertained. And it's way more salacious story if she is this wolf in sheep's clothing, rather than it was an accidental poisoning or it was a suicide or some other thing.
Well, even that she could commit a murder just like a man could, really, and it not be
that it was shocked,
abnormal.
like, can you believe a woman would do this?
Yeah. And I do think we have to take into consideration also language of the time is different than now.
Right.
But that goes to speaking towards, I think, so are ideas and your thoughts. On the flip side, the men in this story are often described using the same words that they'll use to describe her: calm or rational, intelligent. But these are all positives for them. Some of the men are described as businesslike, unemotional, again, pluses. The other side is that several men are described as naive, helpless, stupid, struck dumb, incapable of thinking around Emma, which are not flattering ideas about men either.
No, that they're her victims. They're her, they're her prey. It was Ledoux, her last husband, that was portrayed as just some yokel from the hills,
right,
that she lured into her wiles.
Exactly. And I should also note the other thing that they don't get too into at the time, but it had to affect how people chose to talk about her or write about her, is that she has been divorced, I guess, a couple of times, really, if you consider she may have been divorced McVicar. And divorce at this time is still not very socially acceptable.
Right.
It's becoming more socially acceptable, but she's been married 4 times and engaged to another person. This is wildly inappropriate socially at the time.
Right, and she's also been connected to a house of ill fame at one point, too.
Right.
So you have a woman who's been divorced multiple times, who could possibly be a bigamist.
Yeah.
But whether that's an actual fact or just clerical error.
They use all that, to paint her in a certain light.
Right.
And not all of the messaging about this case comes directly out of the articles. For instance, I saw an article about the case in a paper, and next to it was a completely different story. It didn't have anything to do about the case. It didn't mention the case, but it was an entire article about how terrible women who marry multiple men are, how they don't value life the same way a woman who marries just once does. So, I mean, people are getting this kind of messaging coming at them, not just from these articles about Emma Ledoux, but also from other things.
It's a societal thing. A man's job was to bring home the bacon. I mean, go out and work, and the woman's job was to stay home and raise the family and be a dutiful, subservient wife.
Yeah, and she kind of breaks that
right.
mold, which several of the men do in the articles as well, but she's really judged for it. There are other ways that people are judged, other kinds of language that's used, not just about women or men. We mentioned the word swarthy earlier to describe when someone described the man that she was with at the train station. And I looked that up. To me, swarthy has a really terrible connotation, but I did look it up. It apparently isn't actually labeled as a word used as a slur, but it does go to mean, or I guess it's supposed to describe someone of Italian descent. Most commonly, I've heard it described to someone who's Portuguese descent. I don't think of it as a flattering word.
No, I think it usually, I've always heard it describe somebody with like darker complected skin. So somebody that was set apart from, I guess, the typical Western European look, you know.
But just a little bit darker.
To me, it has the same connotation as like brutish. Like you're like you're not quite look like everyone else.
Well, and we should say that at the time, people of Italian descent were not treated the same. There was a lot of discrimination. And to that point, there were other people in this story. The two people that they talked about at the Lexington Hotel in San Francisco who brought evidence that they had seen Mr. and Mrs. McVicar there, they were of Japanese descent. And the paper and the police go out of their way because they want to use them as witnesses to explain that even though they're Japanese, they were trustworthy for this reason or that reason. And so it's not just men and women who are maligned in these articles. It's also...
No, in fact, at this time, it was not uncommon for the testimony of people that were not Western European to be thrown out of court or not even allowed to testify in some cases, or their words not being held up to the same light as somebody that was white.
Right. And I should say that we've seen language like this in several cases, so not just in 1906, and also talking about perpetrators, but also victims. And if people remember back to our episode on Ketty, I was really bothered by a lot of the language that was used in that case to describe the victims, to describe Sue Sharp, the person who was murdered in that case.
Right, who happened to be a single mother who was trying to provide for her kids, but because she was living in a certain place and not necessarily fit everyone's mold of what their idea of a good mother was,
right,
there was some instances of her being maligned.
Exactly. And this case is just really, it's good because you can see how clearly the language is used, where in other cases it's not quite as clear, but it's still there. People are getting a ton of messages about the crime and about the people involved. And for me, it made vocabulary and the stereotypes about both men and women just a part of this case, essential to understanding not just why I had problems with how vehemently they believe she committed this crime, but why I had problems with what happens as it goes to trial. Because on April 2nd, 1906, a grand jury is impaneled and they indict Emma on the charge of murder. The jury only heard witnesses, and it doesn't actually get any direct evidence. The prosecutor is saving that for the actual trial. What I can say is the district attorney is no longer looking for someone who may have been with Emma. He's completely discounted that as a possibility. A few police go out and look for someone. They do it while they're trying to get information on McVicar in Jamestown, where he was living, and other places. And they never actually find someone, which isn't evidence to me that someone wasn't there, but...
There is, though, eyewitnesses say that she was with somebody. I mean, I know her story changes depending on who it is.
Yeah.
I mean, she eventually will say once that it's just Joe Miller. But there are other non-connected people to her saying, yes, there was somebody else with the two of them at various times in that day before the body was found.
Right. And the DA just discounts that for whatever reason. They just don't believe it. I don't know if someone was with her. I don't know if witnesses were just not seeing something correctly or they thought they saw. That happens a lot even now. People are just bad witnesses. But other than the people that we already mentioned, there are other people who see them. There's a ticket agent they find who says a man bought their tickets for them on the 24th. So the day that they found the trunk.
Right.
There's a baggage man who says he saw the man checking other baggage with her. And a police officer actually reported a man who fit the description had been at the train station every day leading up to the day the McVicars came to Stockton, so that Friday, and then he disappears. He said the man appeared to be watching people and baggage. So I don't feel great about the DA just choosing to say, yeah, there wasn't another man there. It's just, it bothers me.
Well, I think that, especially the last one, I mean, I can see you discounting, I guess, eyewitnesses maybe that saw something similar but maybe conflicting descriptions. But you have a policeman whose whole job is to observe and report, and he's saying that this person is matching the description and had been there before, which kind of leads into the narrative that he was there looking for somebody to steal from, saw them get off the train, they're richly dressed, follows them, strikes up with a friendship with them, and then one thing leads to another, and then McVicar's in a trunk.
Yeah, I don't know. My guess is that there was disagreement with police. Like I said, they never find anyone, so that makes it difficult. But not finding someone, as I said, doesn't mean it didn't happen or that person didn't exist. But the fact that this is all leaking out to the press or getting to the press makes me think that the DA, and the DA is quite clear. There's tons of quotes of him saying, this man does not exist. We don't believe he exists. She's lying. But it makes me think that maybe there were others who thought perhaps there was somebody else.
It's another case, though, of them having a narrative and pursuing that narrative to the exclusion of everything else. So they have the story, they have their victim, they have their killer, and then they're going to get what matches their narrative.
Right. And the DA definitely strikes me as someone who has a narrative. In April, McVicar's brother takes him home to be buried in Wichita, which isn't actually important to the case, but I wanted people to know mainly because you now know he's not sitting out so people can see him. It is reported that the DA is ready to go to trial, but is at a disadvantage because he doesn't have evidence that proves a murder has been committed, other than the appearance of what happened and the fact, and that he especially doesn't have a motive. Trial set for May 22nd, 1906. However, the trial of Emma Ledoux would be interrupted before it even starts when California experiences one of the largest catastrophes in its history. At 5:12 a.m. on April 16, 1906, a small earthquake, known as a foreshock, hit the San Francisco area along the San Andreas Fault. About 20 to 25 seconds later, the Great Earthquake of 1906 struck the area. Described as like the roar of 10,000 lions, the earthquake registered as a magnitude 7.9 on the Richter scale, and knowing its magnitude is not nearly enough to fully understand how massive this earthquake was. San Francisco City was hit the hardest, but the earthquake was felt as far south as Los Angeles and as far north as Oregon. It lasted approximately 45 to 60 seconds, and over 3,000 people were killed. It was followed by a massive fire that burned 500 city blocks, which included 28,000 buildings. Not only was this earthquake terrible for people, but for the purposes of our story, it meant the trial had to be put off and that evidence and witnesses in San Francisco are either destroyed or go missing.
The earthquake also leaves 250,000 people homeless.
It just kind of messes with everything. So whether someone has passed away and can no longer be a witness or just sort of disappears and become homeless, it's just hard to know.
Right. It's not like this case had a huge amount of irrefutable evidence to begin with, and then throw on top of that the worst natural disaster to hit California in its history. There's not much more to say than that.
Right. With what they have left, the trial of Emma Ledoux begins on June 5th, 1906. Emma has pleaded not guilty, and she has a few lawyers at this time. Charles Crocker from Jackson, who's a well-known lawyer there, and Charles Farrell from San Francisco. And he's a big-time criminal defense attorney from San Francisco, and he's really, really well-known. He participated in the graft cases, which are a big deal at the time, and he's written some books, and I think he eventually teaches. And there will be several issues with this case, from my perspective at least. And the first we've talked about many times, impartiality. In order to create a jury, the sheriff and coroner in Stockton are sent out to gather 75 men from the area. And while choosing the 12 men for the jury from that pool sounds pretty similar to what happens now, with each side getting to ask questions and then getting to object, having to pick from a pool of people brought together by two people testifying for the prosecution really bothered me. And it turns out it bothered her lawyers as well. They put forth an objection to the jury pool, citing bias and prejudice of the men creating it, but the judge, whose name is Judge Nutter, overrules them. Once there are 12 men put on the jury, one of the first things they do is put a motion to the judge to force the prosecution to prove the corpus delicti, which means concrete evidence of a crime. The judge overrules this motion, and out of everything I read, I never saw the prosecution present evidence that McVicar was actually murdered.
So that means her defense attorneys were trying to say, before we even start this at all, we want you to prove that there was an actual murder and not suicide or accidental death or whatever. But you have to prove to the court that it's murder before we even start. And then the judge just
says no. Yeah, they want evidence that, like you said, there's a crime. Because, like I said, that I don't see. I mean, I was obviously not in the courtroom, but I didn't see evidence an actual crime had been committed. Publicity for this trial is still going strong, and every day the courtroom is packed with people, even flowing into the street. Once again, the press points out the majority of people in the courtroom are women, which I think is just interesting. I guess women have been interested in true crime for a while.
But they're not allowed on the jury.
No, they aren't allowed on the jury. During the trial, the prosecution will have over 60 witnesses and many, 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 many pieces of evidence. There's a huge list, so I'll just give you some examples. The trunk, the tray, some sort of tray, the rope, clothes from McVicar and Emma, a suitcase, a hammer, a knife, wrapping paper, string, a watch, bottles, food items, poisons, and the list was really, really long. And it must be pretty exciting for people to be in the courtroom to catch a glimpse of all the things they've read about, all the tiny pieces.
Well, yeah, I mean, I can remember back watching court TV with certain big cases and being fascinated by just the minutia of the case and how much detail and getting wrapped up in that. And I can only imagine being in a huge capital case like this.
Yeah, they're excited.
Right.
And while the prosecution has a lot of witnesses and items and evidence, they have another problem other than proving he was definitely murdered, and that's motive, which is something we should talk about because apparently they have some trouble finding one that has evidence to back it up. The motive they settle on is a mixture of two things, bigamy and theft. The prosecution posited that McVicar found out somehow that Emma was married to Ledoux, and knowing that they were still married, threatened her in some way. So in order to keep him from telling Ledoux they were married, she lured him to Stockton, getting him to withdraw money or buy things along the way. With these things she's intending to steal, with the ultimate goal of ending his life and perhaps hiding his body so no one will find out. Now, to prove this, they actually do introduce letters. They call them love letters. They were letters from Emma to Eugene Ledoux over the years, including the time that she had been married to McVicar, hoping to prove that she loved Ledoux and would just basically do anything from losing him. And bigamy, we should also note, is a crime, so she could have faced jail time if they were, in fact, she was still married to McVicar and then married this other person.
But there's still that question of whether they were actually, I mean, they don't have court records or they don't have divorce papers to prove that they were actually divorced, though, correct?
No, they don't present them. The prosecution presents papers that her and McVicar, they present their marriage certificate.
Marriage certificate.
But she maintains they were divorced, or she thought they were divorced. But yeah, there's no actual paperwork that says they were absolutely divorced. As we said, I don't know if they're still married. Even so, she does seem to be doing what she wants, even though she's married to Eugene Ledoux. I don't know if that's enough of a reason to murder McVicar. She's kind of coming and going. The prosecution does bring some witnesses from where he was living in Jamestown. They report that Emma had spent some of the early part of March there with him. He was telling people they were going to be living with each other and tells someone he's moving to Jackson to work for more money on her family ranch. Another woman says that while Emma was there, she asked to use her stove to burn letters her and McVicar sent to each other. The prosecution uses this as evidence she had been thinking of killing him for some time. It's just hard because each piece of evidence sort of separately is kind of convincing, like why is she burning letters? But altogether, I'm not sure it fits. I mean, they had some people in Jamestown saying they were moving back there and that he had told them that.
Right.
There are some people saying he had told them they were moving to Jackson. I just don't know that all makes sense together.
Well, yeah, it's just an odd situation.
Like each piece separately is kind of convincing, but then when you see it all, I don't know.
Well, yeah, and even not necessarily convincing, but just odd. And again, it's back to that, like, yeah, I can see her burning those letters back and forth, especially if they've moved a lot, in the short time they've been married, 3 different states. And so I can see them getting ready for your big move and burning letters, or, if in her mind they're getting divorced and they're getting ready to start a new chapter in their life or whatever, just getting rid of old stuff.
Yeah, and I think there are other things that are confusing. That she tried to get the body sent to Jamestown first. That's what she originally wanted, was put on the Jamestown train, and then eventually get sent to Jackson because they missed that. I don't know why. I don't really know what she's thinking there. When they catch her, she only has $4 on her. So if a mixture of this motive is somehow money or stealing, she doesn't really have a lot with her. I mean, she does try to have the furniture that he bought sent to Jackson, but I don't know if that's more her trying to cover up what's happening.
Yeah, but she's from Jackson. Again, it's odd. It's I know I killed my husband. I had him buy me a bunch of furniture, and then I'm sending it to my house where my family is.
Right.
So any police officer worth their salt would be able to see we have McVicar dead. His wife just shipped something to Jackson and track her down there. It's just, I don't know. It's odd to me.
Yeah. It did remind me of an episode during the episode on Puente, because you talked a lot about how women kill for money.
Yeah, it's one of the main reasons that women serial killers or women killers in general why they
motive.
kill.
Yeah.
It's their main motive is money, but it's usually to keep themselves in a certain type of lifestyle.
Right. And I'm not saying that's what happened here, but
No.
it's just interesting. The second motive, which isn't used in the courtroom, but I want to address it because it is in the papers and it's talked about a lot, is that she marries men for their insurance. And again, I'm not saying that she doesn't marry men for their money or that she doesn't use men for their money, but the only person she's actually ever accused of murdering is McVicar, and he didn't really have very much money on him. So that just seems kind of like a motive that's not real.
Well, and McVicar, his insurance, she was not the beneficiary?
No, his mother was.
So I'm assuming she probably knew that too.
I mean, she mentions it to Healy.
So
she tells him that he has insurance payout, but she's not the beneficiary.
But the brother was going to see that he would get a little bit, but that's not, I guess people have died for less, but it seems odd that she knows that she's only getting a portion of it.
Yeah.
Why go to all that trouble and take the chance?
They also bring up her moral character during the trial, the prostitution, as we talked about before, the drinking, the fact that she's been married multiple times. The defense that Emma's lawyers present is that Emma and McVicar were accustomed to drinking and using morphine, and that McVicar had either taken an overdose, either by mistake or on purpose, because he was upset of losing Emma to Ledoux. Fearing that no one would believe a woman like her, she couldn't call the police. And interestingly, they don't bring up another person who may have helped her. Her defense doesn't include that in her defense. They do introduce witnesses that confirm both of their morphine uses. Her mom even testifies that she stuck her morphine in jail. And her lawyers try to get a witness on the stand who would have said that during the time Emma was a prostitute, she was actually a prostitute at McVicar's behest. He needed money for more speculating, and this was a way for him to get it.
Oh, so, that goes to a lot to say that he had no money to begin with.
Right. He's kind of blown through it, speculating.
Although that could also be seen as more of a motive for her to kill him. If she was forced into prostitution because he was getting money out of her and then turning around and using it for his own business.
Oh, like she's angry?
Yeah.
Yeah, except he's not doing it now. I don't know. And several witnesses or items the prosecution enters into evidence backfires on them. Several of the people McVicar worked with, report that he often had poisons on him for various reasons. Also, their expert witness testifies that the trunk was not hermetically sealed, meaning he should not have suffocated whilst in the trunk, which is what they present as happening. The expert himself got in the trunk for 45 minutes and was fine, able to breathe. He monitored his blood pressure and pulse. He had no issues. And this is a minor thing. McVicar most likely died in the trunk from, maybe an overdose. But I do think it shows a quick rush to judgment instead of carefully getting facts together.
Right. I think it's interesting that they did that one in court. Jumped into the trunk and locked it for 45 minutes.
Their own witness. Supposedly, it was a pretty crazy trial. Joseph Healy yelled on the stand. Emma's mother passed out in court. It's packed with people, as I said. Her lawyers had 1,200 objections throughout the entire case. Apparently, it was a pretty interesting show. It's finally sent to the jury, and apparently the jury room has a really large window that faces out to a grassy area outside, and people stood outside on this and watched the jury deliberate, which I don't even know what to say to that.
It's so odd. I guess, again, my own bias, I feel like this type of proceedings are, traditionally supposed to be solemn and kind of behind closed doors and kind of this huge edifice to justice, and it's there to protect things. But this is more circus-like.
Yeah.
And spectator sport. It's somewhat reminiscent of the Romans in the Colosseum and watching.
It's definitely interesting. I assume these things are why we change them, why we make laws about them.
Yeah.
On June 23rd, 1906, she's found guilty of murder in the first degree with no recommendation of mercy. Since there was no recommendation of mercy, the judge had no choice but to sentence her to hang. She's sentenced to hang in San Quentin prison, and her lawyers immediately appeal, and this stops all proceedings in her hanging until a court decides to pass or grant her appeal. It takes until May 19th, 1909, so 3 years later, when the Supreme Court of California overturns Emma's conviction and grants a new trial. The grounds on which they overturned the case is that the judge erred when he didn't allow the challenge made by the defense regarding the 75 men gathered by the sheriff and coroner. Basically, that they were prejudiced against Emma and found men wishing to see her hanged. There was also one juror in particular who had told people during the trial he would hang her, so she didn't receive a fair and impartial trial. After the ruling, the prosecution had to decide whether or not to retry the case. The first trial was very expensive. Emma's lawyers made an appeal for mercy and claimed she was very sick with tuberculosis and couldn't stand another trial. Emma had spent the years waiting on her appeal in Stockton jail, so the entire time she's just been in the Stockton jail. And the DA sent doctors in to examine her. They ran tests and said they couldn't find any evidence she had tuberculosis. The DA claimed she was lying in order to gain sympathy. And I don't know if she was lying about being sick. Obviously, tuberculosis would have shown up on a test. I do know she suffered pretty severe morphine withdrawals in jail and she could have also been sick with stress. The newspapers do describe the way she looks in court as, quote, wan and pale and wasted in flesh, coughing incessantly and spitting blood, the mere ghost of her former self. So I don't know. They could have been tricked, I suppose, as well.
And again, it's hard to tell with some of these stories because how much of them are fiction built by writers and how much of them are true. I mean, that could be morphine withdrawal.
Right. Either way, in 1910, she takes a deal from the prosecution to avoid another trial. She takes life in prison for the murder of Albert N. McVicar and is sent to San Quentin. So Emma Ledoux is the first woman ever to be sentenced in California to be hanged. But she doesn't actually get hanged. She instead goes to prison for life.
On a plea deal.
On a plea deal, yeah. Her story isn't quite over yet. She's a model prisoner, and in 1917, she's granted parole and is released in 1920. It takes time for her to get released because a condition of her parole is that someone needs to be responsible for her. And in this case, that person was legally Eugene Ledoux because he's still her husband, which I couldn't believe, but...
I mean, from what you say, they're childhood sweethearts. So I am surprised that he... through all of this, still stays married to her.
Well, that's what the paper says. I don't know if they actually were childhood sweethearts or if that's just kind of a making of the paper.
More window dressing.
But as soon as she gets paroled, he moves pretty quickly to get their marriage annulled. It might actually be a case of divorce being difficult to get in California at this time, which is surprising considering...
It was a huge part of...
She's had divorces.
Right. And a huge part of this case was the fact that, was she or wasn't she divorced?
Right. She's paroled in 1920, and in 1925, she marries a man named Frederick Crackbaugh and lives with him on his ranch in Napa Valley. Her parole officer has to approve the marriage, and he does, but things don't stay good for very long. The ranch gets into financial trouble, and in 1929, Crackbaugh passes away from natural causes. He had been sick through most of their marriage, and there's no belief she did anything to him, murdered him, or anything. But it's Emma Ledoux, so of course the papers have to cover it, and people have to make inferences.
Right.
In 1931, Emma gets into trouble again after she violates her parole a couple of times. Once for vagrancy, and another time for passing forged checks. She's dating a man at the time named Albert Thompson, and he takes full responsibility for the checks, says she didn't know. He has a criminal history as well, but this isn't the only time she gets into trouble for forged checks. Her parole officer says that he's getting constant complaints about her, and in June of 1931, she's sent back to San Quentin when she violates her parole for being involved in a marriage bureau racket. And I actually saw a lot of ads warning men of this when I did this research.
And the marriage bureau rackets were, it was like a con. So young men would get letters from eligible, quote unquote, what they thought were eligible women, asking for money and seeking marriages. And these men would then send money to the women. And then obviously there's no marriage, and it's just a way of, it's like the Nigerian prince email.
Right.
If you give me money now and everything will be great later, and then come to find out there's no marriage, there's no woman, it's a graft.
When she goes back to prison, she has 3 requests, which I found just funny that she had requests. That's kind of the point of prison. She wanted her old prison number, her old cell, and to work as a seamstress, as she did when she was in prison before. She also talks to the press directly during this time, so it's my first real glimpse into who she is. She never really talked to the press directly before. She blames everything that happens to her on, quote, circumstances. Things she claims happen to everyone, but work out worse for her for some reason. She's also upset the courts won't let her marry Albert Thompson. They apparently tried to marry in jail, but the courts just no, I don't think so. She does say something interesting, or I found interesting, about what happened to McVicar during this time. This is a direct quote from her to a newspaper. Quote, "McVicar was my ex-husband. He wanted me to go back to him, and I met him at the house of my brother-in-law to talk things over. When I would not return to him, he poured some poison, which he had brought from the mine, and urged that we should both die in a suicide pact. He drank his portion and died, but I did not drink mine. I have often wished I had. My brother-in-law was terrified lest we be accused of McVicar's murder. That was why we put the body into the trunk. I checked the trunk, but it missed the train on which I fled and was found. For the sake of my sister and her 3 children, I stood everything alone. During the 3 years I spent in the Stockton jail while the case was being tried and appealed, my brother-in-law was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment for forgery. He was bad clear through, but I was the one who was sentenced to hang." And I can't prove most of this. It's just another thing she's saying happened. Some of it fits. I do know her brother-in-law was in prison with her. I actually saw that in the papers. I don't know. What do you think of this quote?
It's interesting. It's again another version of the story.
Yeah. It does include another person though this time.
Which would fit with the eyewitness accounts of a third person.
Right.
But the trunk was delivered to the hotel, not the brother-in-law's house. Unless that's just a turn of phrase that's where he was staying.
Yeah, I don't know.
And then the brother-in-law...
Or this is somehow a condensed version of everything that happened throughout the month.
Right, because the brother-in-law
really
the brother-in-law comes from out of state to visit the body, unless that's all put on too.
No, her sister's husband.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
so Emma
both
Ledoux's
brother-in-law.
sister's husband.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know.
Emma Ledoux is eventually moved to the women's prison in Tehachapi, and there she stays until she dies from ovarian cancer on July 7th, 1941. As I said when I started this episode, if you look this case up, you'll find that it's generally written about from the perspective that Emma Ledoux murdered Albert McVicar. Even the papers at the time it was happening are written from this perspective. My perspective, I don't know. The more you know, the more you get to know Emma Ledoux, the more unlikable she is, and she is most likely some sort of con woman. Definitely when she was released from jail, and perhaps even before. I do have doubts about what happened the night McVicar died. It seems to me that what the district attorney chose a narrative to fit what he thought happened, and relied on Emma's indisputable connection to the trunk, with little to no other evidence to convict her. Other theories seem just as plausible. Here's what I know for sure. Albert McVicar did not deserve to be put into the trunk and left at the train station. Unfortunately, after reading about this story, I really don't feel like I know much else. The hows and the whys just sort of hang there. I also don't know exactly what kind of person Emma Ledoux was. The way it's reported in the news makes her even harder for me to trust the depictions. I'm going to assume she wasn't the perfect example of the gentler sex, nor the chief murderess of California. Like everyone else, she probably falls somewhere in between. Ultimately, I don't believe Emma Ledoux received a fair trial. The publicity in this case probably meant that was never in the cards. And since the only jury trial she ever received was found to be highly impartial, we'll never know if she was guilty. What is clear is that a fascination with female murders in 1906 is one that lasts today. I'd like to thank Charles for being here with me tonight as I explore this case. You've listened to me talk nonstop about it for a few weeks now. Do you have any last thoughts?
Yeah, I came into this case thinking, I'd read some of the news clippings and some of the articles that have been written on her on various websites and how she's portrayed, and I admit I thought she's guilty. I mean, it's an interesting story. It's a neat, and this is a terrible thing to say. I don't mean neat as in.
No, I understand.
But it's a interesting case to juxtapose with Dorothea Puente. There's a lot of similarities in between, kind of how they're portrayed.
Yeah.
But after listening to this, I agree with you. I don't know. I really don't. I agree with you that she definitely did not get a fair trial. I think there's a lot more there than probably was revealed.
Right. I just don't think they knew.
Right.
But they did feel she had done this, so they were going to try her.
Right, exactly.
And I mean, she goes to jail, so I suppose it succeeds on their half.
Right.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of California True Crime. We'd also like to thank again Edith Holbert for giving us the idea for the episode. A big thank you to our train expert, Bill Dyer, and to our quality control manager, Melanie Duncan. If you're interested in talking about the case, be sure to reach out to us on our Facebook page. For more information or to explore pictures and links, be sure to visit our website at californiatruecrime.com. You can follow us on Twitter or Instagram at CaliTrueCrime. If you like this episode and are interested in hearing more from us and have the ability, please visit our Patreon page, and we'd always appreciate you giving us a review.